Shall we just pray for a moment? Dear God, we pray that you will speak to us words of life, and that the life of the words spoken will produce in us life to be lived. Amen. During the morning services, we are talking about the life of Joseph, from pit to palace. And during this time, we have asked a few very important questions. We asked the question of Joseph. First, the question of the big what. What's it all about? What is life all about? We also asked the question, the big why. Why is life? And today, this morning, and what I would like to talk to you about this afternoon is the big who. Who am I? But I want to play you first a video to mention what we are talking about.
(9:30 Cape Town now).
I'm sorry, sir. That flight is
That
closed.
is a business class ticket.
Yes, sir, we could arrange a
Do
later
you know
flight.
who I am?
Introducing the rich aroma and distinctive taste of a new premium tea, Joko Gold.
I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? There's a gentleman here who doesn't know who he is. If anyone is able to assist him, please report to the information desk.
Joko Gold gives you strength when you need it.
So I hope he found out who he is. The big question that we may ask ourselves this afternoon is, who am I? And if we ask that kind of question, maybe we could answer that by saying, I am, and then a few dots. I am a man. I am maybe your job. I am a Korean. And so many things that you can associate yourself with that make up exactly who you are and what you are. If I read the life of Joseph, it's very interesting that the Bible allocates so much time and so much space to this man. In Genesis, where we find the story of Joseph, we read the story of four major figures in the history of the Bible. We read the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. Interesting is that Joseph takes up the most space of all these figures, even more than Abraham. And that is why the Bible is very adamant that we learn from the life of this man. His life, or his name, means to increase, to become more. And we see his life enclosed with two text verses. The first is in Genesis 37, verse 2. 37, verse 2 talks about, it is Joseph entering the life stage. He was 17 years old. He was his father's blue-eyed boy. And then Genesis 37, verse 2 tells us how he split on his brothers. So all their wrongdoings, he was the whistleblower. We get the idea of Joseph as a kind of a spoiled brat. And then not really loved by everyone. He was loved by his father. But his brothers, of course, they didn't like him that much. So later on, we see how he was sold. And he was thrown in a pit and sold as a slave. And then the other enclosure of his life is in Genesis 50, verse 20. In Genesis 50, verse 20, he looked back on his own life and he tells his brothers, You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good. And in between those two brackets of his life is a very bumpy ride, a very eventful ride and adventure for this young man. We know that he was his father's favorite son, and then he was betrayed, and then he was sold into slavery. He was purchased by Potiphar. He rose in the house of Potiphar and was falsely accused by his wife. Then he was thrown into prison. He met the baker and the butler, but the butler forgot all about him. And then he stood before Pharaoh with a dream. He became prime minister, he met his brothers, and he provided his family with a home in Egypt. Quite a bumpy road, we would say. But if we ask him the question, Joseph, who are you? He would have answered us, well, I am Jacob's son. My grandfather is Isaac. My great-grandfather is Abraham. I come from a lineage of very important people. He would answer maybe, well, I am 17 years old. I'm a teenager, late teenager. He might answer us more. I am my father's favorite son. And so he can carry on with a lot of I ams. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said, now with God's help, I will become myself. And we find that in the life of Joseph. At first, all these things that were so great about him, and then a crisis in his life where he became what and who he was. So we would like to explore his identity, the who in Joseph, with 3 statements. The first statement is, I am. And after I am, we can put a full stop or a period. The second that we find him, the second stage in his development is I am with a question mark. And the third one is I am with the exclamation mark. And when we look through the life of Joseph, maybe we can identify with that. Maybe we can put ourselves in his shoes. Maybe we can say to ourselves, well, what is my I am with a full stop? What is my I am with the question mark? What is my I am with the exclamation mark? Let's look at him with a full stop in his life. The full stop after I am. The full stop tells me the orientation, the facts, things that you don't really question. That's the way we grow up. As a young person, we grow up in a certain family and a certain environment. And that environment tells us this is who you are. If you're a little boy, you grow up with blue clothes and everything is boyish. If you're a girl, with pink things, and that is your identity. We grow up in a certain culture. We grow up in a certain ethnic association, religious, gender. All of that makes up who we are. So with Joseph, who are you? I am Joseph. I am the son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac, great-grandson of Abraham, the apple of my father's eye. I'm the brother and half-brother of 11 brothers and 1 sister who don't really like me. I'm part of a big family. I'm a Canaanite. I tend my father's flock. I am a dreamer. And how did his brothers hate his dreams? I am handsome. I'm young. So he identified himself in all of those things. That was who he was. No questions asked. That was his identity, and that was Joseph, a full stop. This is maybe who we are. We identify ourselves with many things. In the world of psychology, they tell us that Erickson tells us that we have to work through certain crises to come to our real identity, to know exactly who we are. And then James Marcia talks about teenagers, about their identity crisis that they have and how they find themselves at a place or work and to a place of identity achievement. So there's very interesting theories about all of that. But let's get back to you and me. Our identity with a full stop is our orientation, who we are. We don't question that much. And it sort of defines who we are. Maybe you define yourself in your gender role. You define yourself in your religion. I'm a Methodist. I grew up as a Methodist. I'm a Methodist. Maybe you say that. You might say, well, I grew up in this family, and because my father is this profession, I chose this profession. You don't question that. Maybe you identify with your job, with your marital status. There are so many things that we identify, we put it all together, and you say, this is me. And this is good. This is my orientation. This is exactly who I am. And then something might change. In Joseph's life, suddenly, without any precaution, without any thinking, he found himself with a question mark after I am. You see, his stable, relaxed life with his dreams, his dad's blue-eyed boyness, his position in the family, everything at some point changed. He was a somebody. And there his brothers, they just throw him in a pit. He was sold as a slave. And from somebody, he was a nobody. If somebody had to peek over the pit and ask him, Joseph, who are you? Or you down there, who are you? And he would say, my name is Joseph. And he would go through his whole identity, son of Jacob, and all of that. Maybe the person listening to him would say, so what? Who cares? Suddenly, it didn't matter. Suddenly, he was in this identity crisis where nothing that defined him makes sense anymore. If you have teenagers, you will understand something of that. Teenagers, they just come to a point in their life, and for a few years, they have no idea who they are. They're this, and then that, and then the other. Joseph, well, he had a bit deeper crisis than just being a teenager. Here he is dumped in a pit, sold as a slave, ends up in Egypt. He knows nobody. Nobody knows him, and it doesn't matter to them. Who am I is the question that he might ask. It's usually in a crisis. It's usually in a trauma. It's usually in a life-changing situation where you have to think again about who am I? When those pillars of identity is removed. And those pillars of identity, well, it doesn't matter that much anymore. You cannot rely on that. You're in this vacuum. You're in this open space of not knowing. When you lost your job, when you are no more the manager or the director or the pastor or the doctor or whatever because we associate so much with our job and our profession. You study for it so many years, and suddenly you lost your job. You retire. That's a big thing. Who am I now? In my former congregation, one of my elders in the congregation was the commissioner of police of the province. He was very high up in the police. He was also the personal advisor of Nelson Mandela. So he was a very mighty, very powerful man. And then he retired. And it was so interesting. He phoned me the day after retirement. Well, I phoned him, I can't remember. And I asked him, Chris, how are you doing? And he hesitated for a moment. He said, do you know what? Last night, 1 minute before 12, if I picked up the telephone and I would give a command, all the police would immediately stand at attention and they would do what I want them to do. He said, do you know what? This morning, the cat ignored me. The cat didn't even greet me. When I spoke to him, he turned his back on me. What a crisis. He had to rethink who he was. Because it's not the rank anymore. It's not a powerful position anymore. And so many of us, we get to that point where we retire and it's fantastic. But who are we now? When there's a death in the family, maybe the death of a spouse, your status change. Maybe it is a time in your life where you divorce, or the children left home, the empty nest syndrome, or you're in an accident, or some major life event happens to you, or just a crisis. And you have to ask the question, who on earth am I now? And we get so many people in this crisis that they cannot handle it, that they simply lost their own, the pillars of their identity, and they start drifting. They just start drifting along. And that brings me to the third. You see, it is orientation, disorientation, where I am with my question mark. I'm disorientated. I don't know who I am. I have to redefine myself. And Joseph had to do that. Joseph, maybe in the worst scenario of anyone's life, he had to do that. He had the crisis of rejection. He had the crisis of being rejected out of his family, his country, his religion, everything. But Joseph came to a point where he could say, I am, with the exclamation mark. This is me. I'm not dependent on any other pillars that might fold. But I have identity that is solid, that gives me a reorientation, that brings me to a point where I can live life fully, because I know exactly who I am. Henry Nouwen says, there are 3 lies of identity. He says, the first lie is, I am what I have. Many people are what they have. And then when bankruptcy gets in, they just lost it. The second, I am what I do. He says that is a lie of identity. And the third, I am what people say I am. So, for the first part of Joseph's life, that was who he was. I am my father's blue-eyed boy. I am this, I am that. So here, in the reading part of this afternoon, we find Joseph in Potiphar's house. And we find something else in Joseph. It's not the same Joseph we found in Genesis 37, the little brat, the one who's a dreamer. There's something different to him. No more is he the tender of a flock. Yes, no more dad's blue-eyed boy. No more the dreamer. But he was a strong Joseph, the man of principles, the man who could say no. The man who could say, I'm a leader. I was appointed in this position, And not because I was only expected to do what I had to do, but out of conviction. Somehow something changed. The real Joseph was emerging. The one who rose from the pit to the palace. That's the one we meet here in Genesis 39. A man who from his identity crisis somehow he found his roots. He found who he was. What was the secret? If you read through that part again, you find again and again, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. The Lord was with him. The Lord made him successful. The Lord. You see, he found identity in the Lord. Let me explain. Not only is it actually that he found his identity in the Lord as a religious experience, but it was God identified with him. That's a difference. It's not something he did, but something God did. And he had nothing else to rely on. He had nothing, no one else to identify with than God. It was a God infusion. In South Africa, we talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu says, I am me because you are you. Ubuntu says, my identity is not only here in this individual, but it is shared. And I think he understood something long before the word was coined. His identity was shared with God's identity. God in him, God with him, God around him. Paul, much later, says something to this effect. He says, it's no longer I who live. I'm crucified with Christ. The I with a period. That I that is so self-sufficient, I'm crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me and through me. That's the secret of his identity. My old self being crucified. It's no longer I who live, but he who lives in me, Christ in me, the hope of glory. Identified with Christ. Henry Nouwen again. Henry Nouwen was a famous professor, was a famous theologian. I mean, in Harvard, people were queuing up just to listen to his lectures. World famous. And then he abandoned all of that. And he went to a little place, secluded, where he was caring for disabled people, mentally disabled people. And then he wrote a book, The Beloved of God. And he found his identity not as the professor, not as the scholar, but as the beloved of God. And that cannot change. Doesn't matter what storms. I am the beloved. I want to close. One day, if I get to heaven, or when I get to heaven, I would like to look for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I would like to ask him a few questions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, maybe you all know who he is, a German theologian who's died as a result of his uprising against Hitler. He wrote a poem, Who Am I? It's a beautiful poem. You might want to read it. But he closes this poem with the following phrase, Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I'm thine. Amen.